They said they needed space, so you gave it to them. You didn't text. You didn't reach out. You didn't try to explain yourself one more time. Because this time, you didn't want to beg to be chosen. You went silent. And while on the surface, they seemed unaffected, posting stories, carrying on, maybe even acting colder than before, there's something they won't admit. They noticed. They felt it. And deep down, they're waiting. Not waiting for an apology. Not for you to come crawling back. They're waiting for proof. Proof that even though you've gone quiet, you still care. That you'll eventually break. That your silence is just another version of pursuit. Delayed, not denied. Because that's the twisted comfort zone of the avoidant. They fear closeness, but they expect you to keep trying. So when you finally stop showing up, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion, they find themselves caught in a psychological war they never expected to lose. The war between needing distance and craving reassurance. They'll never say it out loud, but they check, they watch, they wonder, they replay the last things you said, not because they're searching for blame, but because your silence has become the loudest mirror they've ever faced. And it reflects something terrifying, that maybe this time you meant it. Maybe you're not just giving them space, you're giving yourself peace. And to the avoidant, that's the real threat, because they built their safety on your reach. They felt powerful when you chased. They felt secure when you explained, begged, overgave. But now you've stopped, and they're not ready for the vacuum that creates. This is what they won't tell you, that even as they pretend to enjoy the quiet, part of them is waiting for the old pattern to return. They want to see if you'll break your silence, if you'll come back with soft words, if you'll reopen the door they emotionally slammed, just to feel control again. But now, the silence is saying something different. It's saying, you see them clearly now, and that clarity shakes them. So here's the real question. What do avoidants actually want when you stop chasing? What are they secretly hoping for, while acting like they don't care? Is it punishment, validation, regret? Or is it something far deeper, something they can't even admit to themselves? Because when the empath goes silent, the avoidant is forced to sit with a fear louder than any words, that you were real, and they pushed it away. They never meant to become avoidant. No child wakes up and decides, I will fear closeness. But somewhere in their early life, love became linked with pressure, or chaos, or control, or worst of all, abandonment that came disguised as affection. So they developed a strategy. Don't need too much. Don't get too close. Don't feel too deeply. Because in their world, closeness led to pain. Maybe their parents were emotionally volatile, too engulfing, or too distracted. Maybe their needs were dismissed, mocked, or ignored. Or maybe they were praised only when they performed. Good grades, independence, emotional detachment. Whatever the reason, they learned that vulnerability wasn't safe. Love was conditional, and dependence was dangerous. So they built a false self. Someone calm, collected, untouchable. Someone who could be in relationships without ever truly being seen. Carl Jung would call this the shadow, the disowned parts of the self, the vulnerable, needy, soft, dependent aspects, buried deep beneath layers of control and emotional distance. The avoidant doesn't hate love. They just fear what it awakens in them. Because to love you, really love you, would require them to meet the parts of themselves they've spent their whole life running from. So when you go silent, you're not just withholding contact. You're confronting their illusion of control. Your absence forces them into stillness. And stillness is where the shadow speaks loudest. Suddenly, they're not avoiding you. They're avoiding the feelings your presence used to distract them from. Regret, longing, unworthiness, a deep-rooted belief that they are fundamentally unlovable. Here's the paradox. Your silence, though painful, is not punishment. It's a mirror, and what it reflects is terrifying, not because of what you did, but because of what they never resolved. They start remembering how safe you felt, how patient you were, how you didn't force them, didn't demand, just stayed until you didn't. And that absence isn't just inconvenient, it's existential. Now, they begin to expect what they've always relied on, that you'll break, that your silence is temporary, that your love will override your boundaries, like it always did. Because deep down, they want proof that love still exists without having to deserve it, without having to open, without having to change. And this is the core of the avoidant dilemma. They fear intimacy, but they crave unconditional love. They want to be chosen without being vulnerable. They want connection without accountability. But now, your silence is doing what your words never could. It's asking them to confront the very thing they tried to avoid by pushing you away, themselves. And they can feel it, not just the loneliness, but the confrontation of truth, that your love was never the threat. Their own repression was. Starts as a flicker, a subtle tension in their chest, a late-night scroll through your old messages, a quiet wondering, did I go too far this time? But they don't reach out. Not yet. They don't know how. Because reaching out would mean admitting something they've worked so hard to suppress, that they feel your absence, that it matters, that you mattered. So they wait, not in peace, but in resistance. They tell themselves you'll come back. You always do. You'll text something soft, check in, break the silence. And when you don't, the illusion begins to crack. Here's what no one tells you about avoidance. They don't just fear closeness. They fear losing the upper hand. Because control is their safety blanket, their emotional anchor. It's how they protect the part of themselves that never felt chosen, unless they were invulnerable. But when you go silent, truly silent, not performatively, you remove the one variable they depended on to feel superior, your pursuit. And without your chasing, something strange happens inside them. At first, they rationalize. They convince themselves it's for the best. They tell themselves they need space, that this is what they wanted. But when the silence lingers, when your presence doesn't reappear in their notifications or energy, their mind starts to loop. Not obsessively like the anxious type, but in quiet, disoriented bursts of memory. You laughing, you listening, you giving without asking much in return. And for a second, they wonder if they ever really knew how to receive it. That's the consequence they never anticipated. That in your absence, they would feel their own emotional poverty. Not because you took something away, but because now, there's no one to distract them from the emptiness they never healed. And while they wait, secretly, stubbornly, hoping you'll reach out first, they also start to fear the deeper possibility that maybe you finally awakened, not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in clarity, because your silence no longer says, I'm hurting. It says, I'm healing. And that, to someone who relied on your emotional dependency, is terrifying. Meanwhile, you're beginning to see something you couldn't see while wrapped in the ache of longing. That their silence didn't mean they didn't care. It meant they didn't know how to. That your pain wasn't proof you were too much. It was a reflection of what they weren't ready to meet in themselves. And that's when something powerful begins to happen. You stop needing closure, because the silence gave you something better. Self-possession. You're no longer trying to decode their avoidance. You're learning how to speak the language of your own nervous system. Safety, calm, truth. And while they sit in the discomfort of your absence, You're learning that real love doesn't come from performance. It comes from peace. And once you taste peace, you stop chasing intensity. The moment of rebellion doesn't look like rage. It looks like stillness, like clarity, like you waking up one morning and realizing you're done trying to prove your worth to someone who keeps avoiding it. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're just no longer available for emotional gymnastics. That's the rebellion the avoidant never sees coming. Not when you yell, not when you cry, not when you threaten to leave, but when you go silent. And stay silent, not out of strategy, but out of healing. Because when your nervous system stops being addicted to their inconsistency, you stop confusing silence for safety. You stop mistaking withdrawal for depth. You stop calling cold love complicated, when what it really is unavailable. Here's the truth. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. The moment you realize that is the moment you break the cycle. Because you're no longer fighting for closeness with someone who's fighting to stay distant. This is where the power shifts. Not because you're playing hard to get, not because you're manipulating the dynamic, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself who thought love was something to win. Now, you don't need to be chosen because you've chosen yourself. And your silence isn't a threat anymore. It's a boundary, a declaration, a quiet rebellion against every time you made yourself small to feel seen. Every time you gave more, waited longer, hoped harder, for someone who could barely hold themselves, let alone your heart. And here's what they feel, though they may never say it. They feel the weight of your detachment, not the cold kind, the peaceful kind, the kind that says, I won't beg for breadcrumbs from someone afraid of a feast. I won't pour love into a cup that pokes holes in every offering. I won't keep proving I'm worthy to someone who's afraid to receive. That's what changes everything. Because the avoidant built their sense of power on your pursuit. And now, they're left with something foreign. Silence without reassurance. Distance without rescue. Freedom without your emotional labor holding everything together. And that's when they begin to feel the loss. Not the loss of control, but the loss of you. The real you. The soft, patient, warm-hearted you. Who kept the connection alive even when they kept pulling away. And when that realization dawns, that maybe you're not just silent, but free, they begin to question everything. Because now, for the first time, you're not orbiting their wound. You're standing in your worth. And nothing shakes an avoidant like the quiet strength of someone who used to need them, but now just knows themselves. They thought you'd always be there, emotionally open, energetically available, quietly waiting behind every shutdown. Because that's how the dynamic had always played out. You felt too much. They pulled away, and you filled the silence with effort. But then, you didn't. This time, your silence wasn't a tactic. It was a turning point. And in that absence, the avoidant didn't just feel confused. They felt confronted by something they've never made peace with. Real love that doesn't chase. See, avoidants don't fear you. They fear what your love awakens in them. Softness, surrender, a tenderness they were never taught how to hold. Because to receive love would mean they'd have to acknowledge all the parts of themselves they locked away long ago. The part that wanted to be chosen. The part that cried when no one noticed. The part that needed, but was told not to. Carl Jung wrote that what we fail to face within, we will meet again as fate. And that's what your silence became. Fate. A mirror. A reckoning. Because when you stopped showing up, their entire emotional framework started unraveling. They expected relief. Instead, they felt recognition. That you weren't the threat. You were the sanctuary. And they walked out of it, thinking there would always be a way back in. But now, The door is open, and you are gone. Not bitter, not closed, just whole. And that wholeness is louder than anything you could say. It says, I loved you deeply, but I will no longer abandon myself to prove it. This is the final truth. The avoidant wasn't waiting for another message. They were waiting for you to stay emotionally available, so they could keep emotionally distant. But when you went silent, for real, you shattered the contract. The contract where you overgave and they underfunctioned, where you chased and they withdrew, where you offered your softness as proof of worth to someone who feared receiving it. That pattern is broken now, and what remains is something far more powerful than winning them back. You, the version of you that no longer confuses love with pain, that no longer calls emotional starvation a challenge, that no longer sees silence as something to solve, but as something to listen to. Because in the quiet that scared them, you found your voice. And now, you don't need their validation. You don't need their closure. You don't even need their return. You've outgrown the need for someone who couldn't hold your heart. Because now, finally, you do.